Okay, so today we're into the start of chapter 21, which is going to talk about absolute rule or European absolutism, which of course deals with absolute monarchy. So we're going to take a look especially at the Spanish Empire and then how during the 1500s they sort of dominated, of course, European power, but also power within the Atlantic region. And so we'll take a look at how that sort of evolves, and then we'll talk specifically about what is absolute rule, some of the causes and effects of how that became popular in Europe. So let's begin with taking a look into the Spanish and how powerful they were during this time period of the 1500s. Essentially, what we have here is we have Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time. He controlled a vast amount of territory throughout Europe. Here are the areas that he controlled: Spain, Spain's American colonies, portions of Italy, Austria, and also the Netherlands. He also ruled at that time what was the Holy Roman Emperor or Empire, which was Germany at the time. So a very vast amount of land was controlled by Charles V. He was a devout Catholic. He was known for that. He fought against both Muslims and Protestants. One of the big issues for him during the time period in which he was in charge of the Holy Roman Empire was, of course, the Protestant Reformation and the movements by Martin Luther, and then the wars that took place after the Reformation. We had war in Germany between Protestant princes that wanted their regions of control to be Protestant and Catholic princes who wanted their areas of control to remain Catholic. This was settled by a treaty that Charles sort of officiated called the Peace of Augsburg in 1555. Charles tentatively, unwillingly, and unhappily actually agreed to allow German princes to choose the religion for their territory. Basically, he saw this as a major loss because prior to the Peace of Augsburg, every region in Germany was predominantly Catholic. After the Reformation, though, as some of these princes wanted to create Protestant strongholds, he now agrees to that. And so now you do have Protestant pockets popping up within the Holy Roman Empire, or which was the Holy Roman Empire. And this division, this loss for Catholicism really bothered him to the point that he decided to go into a state of retirement, essentially, and gave up his throne, which divided the empire into really two partitions. His brother, Ferdinand, became the ruler of Austria, so he gained the lands of Austria and also the Holy Roman Empire, which is kind of like modern-day Germany, that region there. His son, Philip II, who we'll talk predominantly about the rest of this section, is going to get Spain, which would also in turn mean he gets the colonies of the Americas, which are bringing in literally boatloads of gold and silver and other wealth and resources. And he also gets the Spanish Netherlands, which is basically a portion of the Netherlands. And it's going to be actually quite fruitful what Philip II gets. If you look at overall where the wealth and the influence is coming from, I think Philip II got the better end of the deal in the short term. In the long term, if you look historically at how Habsburg Austria and then eventually Germany started to develop, you might be able to argue that Ferdinand in the long term got the better end of this division. Okay, let's take a look at Philip II's empire. A nice map would be right here. This is kind of the area that we're talking about. Well, no, we don't have the American colonies on this map, but you can kind of see the areas that Philip takes over, and that's going to be Spain. You've got the Spanish Netherlands here. You got parts of Italy. These are areas that, okay, Ferdinand gets these regions here and this region here. He's also going to get part of Italy. But nonetheless, this is kind of the area that Spain dominated in Europe during this time span. We'll come back to this slide in a little bit when we talk about the Spanish Armada trying to attack England under the leadership of Queen Elizabeth. But for right now, let's take a look at Philip II. Philip was actually known as a pretty shy, yet serious and religious individual. One of the things that if you read about him, biographies written about him, he didn't really trust many people. He was very hardworking, but the fact that he trusted no one meant that he had to do a lot of his own work, and that can become tiresome. He was known as the king who never slept because he oftentimes would put a lot of work on his own shoulders. So he was very hardworking. He had to be if he didn't really delegate work, and that's a something to think about in leadership. If you can't trust the people who work for you, then it's going to be really difficult for you to delegate tasks, and you're going to be doing a lot of work on your own, which can become very stressful. So you really want to surround yourself with great leadership individuals that can get the job done. If you're going into business, or if you're going to be a coach, something along those lines, these are things that you really want to think about in leadership positions. He was aggressive in expanding his empire. In 1580, he seized the Portuguese kingdom when their king had died without an heir to the throne. That was King Henry. This move gained all of the Portuguese colonies in Africa, India, and in the East Indies. So that was kind of a nice acquisition there for Spain. Eventually, they're going to earn their freedom and independence, but that at least was a move by Philip. The vast amounts of wealth coming in from the American colonies in gold and silver was really, really important. Some historians will say that the king would claim 1/4 of every shipload as his royal share. But if you really read a lot of the documentation, you'll find that there's something called the royal fifth, which usually what would mean is if you acquired any gold or any silver in the New World per se, you'd have to partition 1/5 of that to go directly to the king when you came back to the port in Spain. And this is something that a lot of kings and queens would do in England, in France, so on and so forth. With this money, though, that was coming in from the colonies, and 1/5/1/4 of it going directly to the king, Philip II and other monarchs were able to create armies and create powerful navies. That's really the idea of why they would bring in that royal share of money based on the exploration. Now, Philip II was known as a defender of Catholicism. When Philip took the throne around 1560, if you remember, Europe was still sort of entrenched in religious wars, which were caused by the Reformation. The Spanish Reconquista, which was the effort to drive the Muslims out of Spain, we learned about this in chapter 20, occurred about 65 years before Philip's reign. So it wasn't too far outside of the scope and picture. Philip's grandparents were Ferdinand and Isabella, who actually used the Inquisition to get rid of heretics within Spain. Now, because of this, Philip felt actually quite a bit of pressure to defend Catholicism within Spain against the Muslims and the Ottoman Empire, Protestants of Europe, Jewish factions within Spain. And so in 1571, Philip actually took to the sea with his great naval force known as the Spanish Armada. It had over 200 Spanish and Venetian ships, Venice being from Italy, to defeat a large fleet near the Bay of Lepanto. It was the Ottoman Turks that were coming in to try and attack there. And then in 1588, he took the Spanish Armada and attacked Protestant England because Queen Elizabeth had supported a Protestant uprising against Philip in the Spanish Netherlands. So Elizabeth, in counter to this, puts together a fleet of her own, which was utilizing smaller, more maneuverable ships, and her navy actually defeated the Spanish Armada in 1588. It was a huge upset, and it's one that goes down in history as a major event. I'll show you some of the key things about this. One of the things that you want to understand is that, of course, the Spanish Armada was the strongest navy in the world, and they sailed in this fashion here. And as they come through the port here region, they have a couple of battles. They then try to regroup, but as they come over the course of Scotland and Ireland, there's a lot of shipwrecks due to storms that took place. So a lot of the Spanish Armada ships were succumbed to storms and crashed, and so they lost a lot of their men and also a lot of their equipment and cannon on those ships as well. One of the things that you'll learn about the Battle of the Armada, as it's called, is that there's two big factors as to why the English were really successful. If you look at the shipwrecks, that was one factor. The second factor, though, were actually tactics. The Spanish Armada had very large ships. They were actually very slow, powerful, yet slow, and they weren't the most maneuverable. The English countered that by creating smaller vessels that were quicker and could move about in a much more feasible manner. And then also what the English did is some of their older, larger ships, they used as what are called fire ships. They would load them up with gunpowder, and they would start them on fire, and they would have just a few sailors direct them into the slower, more stationary Armada ships and direct them directly into them. And then they would jump ship into the water and those ships would then explode when they kind of knocked into the Spanish Armada ships. So that was one of the other tactics that played a fairly influential role in the Battle of the Armada. Despite this loss, though, I got to tell you, Philip and Spain still kind of had a great deal of wealth. And Philip, after this, built one of the most magnificent palaces called the Escorial. It's made of gray granite, and it also within it had a monastery. A couple of questions that I would ask my students at this time, I would want to check to make sure that they understood what we were talking about. I would try to get them to think about what are some non-religious factors that might have provoked Philip II to send the Armada against England. And some possible answers here, just thinking logically, number one, he's a male, and he's going against a female. Back in these times, there was a lot of chauvinism, and these men who were kings, they thought that, oh, if it's a female ruler, well, we'll just be able to go over there and defeat them. And so far from the truth, time and time again, we see historically that that is not the case at all. And so that's just not a very logical response there, but it's something that happened quite a bit. And then second, you got to think about during this time when Spain, when England, when Portugal, France, the Dutch, they're all kind of competing for claims and stakes in the New World, the Americas, but also in the East. There's a lot of maritime rivalry going on here. Exploration, colonization, you have pirating of ships going back and forth. So by defeating the English Navy, this would really put a stamp on the Spanish supreme power on the seas. And that was one of the big motivating factors there. So it's kind of nice if students can have some background knowledge, do a little bit of the reading before we come into the lesson, and then they might be able to enter their own thoughts on questions like this. Second, what is the significance of England's defeat of the Spanish Armada? Well, it does weaken Spain, and it opens up for more European ventures into the Americas, because with the Armada being downshifted a little bit in power and the number of ships, they're not able to defend against piracy, and they're not able to ward off English/French/Dutch ships that are trying to get to the Americas for exploration. Roman numeral 2 talks about the golden age of Spanish art and literature. This took place during the 16th and 17th centuries. That would be the 15 and 1600s, which is when Spain was experiencing a golden age overall. There really are two great Spanish painters that you want to have a recollection of. First one is named El Greco because he's the Greek. He was born on the island of Crete, back the home place of the Minoans back in chapter 4 that we learned about. But his real name is Dominicos Theotokopoulos, so you can see that that's not a Spanish name. That's definitely a Greek name, but I think that's another reason why they called him the Greek, because that'd be a long name to say all the time. He painted real people, but yet with supernatural qualities. And one of the things he's also known for is a plethora of color schemes. If you check out some work by El Greco, you'll find that he has human structures, but a lot of times their necks are elongated or their arms are elongated. That's sort of what I mean when I say supernatural qualities. Diego Velazquez is probably the more famous of the two Spanish painters, but he was known for very rich colors, and he did many realistic portraits of the royal family. Here's an example of a Diego Velazquez painting. I'll try to zoom in here a little bit. So what this is called Las Meninas. This is basically a painting of the royal family, the children in the royal family. One interesting thing, here's El Greco. He's actually has his painting brush and his canvas here. And then this is the painting that he's drawing on. He's actually not painting this. Okay, what's interesting about this painting is there's a mirror in the background. So what he's painting is a portrait of the king and the queen. Okay, King Philip and his wife. And that is what is on this poster board. So this is a portrait within a self-portrait. And here's the king in the background right here also. But it also is just a regular painting of Las Meninas. So there's a lot going on in this painting. If you ever take an art history class, this would be a really good one to take a look at. I've taken one art history class, and basically what you do, it's really an awesome class, because what you do is you go to class, and in my experience, the professor will have different slides. Oftentimes they're of historical subject matter. So if you're taking congruent history courses like this one in world history, It will connect to what you're learning about. And then what you do is you kind of contemplate the picture, and you'll try to figure out, hey, what was the author's motivation? What were they trying to get across? I'm sorry, the artist's motivation. What were they trying to portray? What are some of the hidden messages here? Obviously, this one has a lot of different clues that you kind of have to follow to figure out. But art history is a great subject, and it might be one that, as you guys get into the college ranks, you might want to just take a little class in there and see what it's like. But we also talk about writing in Spain. The birth of the European novel is from Don Quixote in 1605. It's authored by Miguel de Cervantes. It's about a poor Spanish nobleman who acts like a heroic knight. He's kind of losing his mind a little bit, Don Quixote is. And the book is actually made to be a mockery of chivalry and the code of knights that was present during the Middle Ages. By this time in the 1600s, the ideas of chivalry and feudalism were sort of starting to deplete in a major way in Europe. And so what this does is it kind of represents the frustrations of materialism. And one of the things I would say in reading Don Quixote that I really took a liking to is the fact that because he's kind of becoming senile, he thinks he's a knight, and he thinks that windmills are giants. And so he literally rides a donkey with a long lance, and he tries to attack windmills. And oftentimes that doesn't turn out very well for him. But Don Quixote, classic Spanish novel. Roman numeral 3 will talk about how Spain weakens due to inflation and taxes. The constant amount of money coming in really led to the decline of the value of money and the increase in the prices of goods. And there are really two causes of Spanish inflation. You have a growing population, which means you have a greater demand for food and goods. And so as demand increases and supply stays the same, one of the things that has to happen is the prices are going to go up. It's all about supply and demand, economically speaking. With an influx of silver, which was what the Spanish used as their form of currency, this flooded the markets, which also reduced the overall value of silver. So you got to understand that money, currency, it's only valuable because it is rare. When it becomes less rare, then it's not going to be as valuable any longer. And so that's one of the things you want to think about here with basic economics. Some other economic problems during this time, the loss of many Muslim Moors, artisans and businessmen were kicked out of the country during the Reconquista. So you lose some of your well-experienced workforce. Also, Spanish nobles during this time, they did not have to pay taxes. This meant that the burden of taxation fell on the lower classes. The result of this is that, okay, you have your nobles who are wealthy, they're at the top. You've got your lower class who's going to be paying a lot of taxes, so they don't have any room to move upward. They didn't have much social mobility. And the result of this is a lack of a middle class. Oftentimes, economies thrive on a strong middle class because, see, if you have a lot of people who are very poor, and you have very few rich, and you don't have a middle class, who's spending money in stores, shops? Okay, if you're poor, you're going to only buy the things that you need for survival. If you have a middle class where people have enough to survive, but yet some money to spend on non-essential goods, that's where the economy can really grow, at least back in these times. Next, let's talk about, because of this, Spanish enemies are getting rich. Remember the policy of mercantilism, which was very popular during this time. It's the idea that your country's power is dependent on your country's wealth. Well, Spain was using old-fashioned or old-school techniques to produce manufactured goods. What we mean by that is that there were some machines being developed, basic machines for making cloth and other factors like shoes. Spain was a little bit behind. They were still making things by hand. This meant that it took goods longer to produce. It required more labor, which is going to mean higher prices. So for people in Spain to buy goods made in Spain, it's going to be more expensive than they might find it in France or England or Portugal or other entities in Europe. And so the response is that Spaniards are going to buy goods from England, France, and the Netherlands. Money is going to flow out of Spain and into the hands of their enemies. And this is going sort of against mercantilism. When in mercantilism you have a lack of a favorable balance of trade, that's going to equal debt from loans that you're going to have to borrow. So really in mercantilism, and even in today's world, economy, a lot of it is based on exports and imports. And back then, Spain, who was exporting a lot, now is going to be bringing in a lot of imports due to the fact of the prices. and that's going to hurt them overall, economically speaking, during the later 1600s, 1700s. Also, we have some rebellion going on, the Dutch Revolt. Spain, you got to remember, a very Catholic, yet sluggish economy, lacking a middle class. The Netherlands at the time, Spanish Netherlands, Protestant in the form of Calvinism, which we learned about back in chapter 17, had a very prosperous economy, prosperous middle class. And so what happens is Philip, seeing that the Netherlands is very economically stable, he tries to raise taxes on them and also tries to sequester the spread of Protestantism there. In 1566, Protestant mobs began to attack Spanish churches and strongholds in rebellion and reaction to this. And then Philip sends in a pretty bad dude named the Duke of Alva. In one day, the Duke of Alva rounded up and executed about 1,500 Protestants and suspected rebels to end these revolts. War would continue to go on for about another 11 years until 1579, when actually the Netherlands ended up winning and declared their independence from Spain. They then became known as the United Provinces of the Netherlands. There were 10 southern provinces, which are modern-day Belgium. These would remain Catholic and under the control of Spain. One of the things that I would ask my students at this point would be, what could Spain have done? What are some things that they could have possibly tried to restore its economy? One thing they could have done that we said they didn't do would be to impose taxes on the wealthy, impose taxes on the nobles. They could also put price controls. This doesn't always work, but you could sort of, if you wanted to have strong and powerful government, you could put a price cap on certain goods, which would then mean that store owners would then be the ones who would be affected by this, but consumers would be more likely to spend money on a loaf of bread if it was, let's say, $1 per loaf than it would be if you set it at $1.50. So what would happen is the government would set the price, which then this is going to anger store owners. And so eventually, because consumers are more willing to spend their money on these goods, it could, in the short term, help. But in the long term, business owners and shopkeepers would have less of an incentive to keep their stores open. So this is something that sometimes can work in the short term, but in the long term, it's most likely not the best idea. Why did the Dutch rebel against the Spanish? Well, Philip raised taxes, and he also tried to sequester their religious beliefs. So money and religion are two big time reasons over the course of history that people rebel or argue or fight. Roman numeral 4 is going to talk a little bit about what was going on in the Dutch Netherlands once they gained their independence. The United Provinces of the Netherlands generally practiced religious tolerance, so you could worship your religion freely. They weren't a kingdom, but they operated as a republic, which is what the United States is, where you elect representatives to then represent you in government. Each province had its own elected governor, and power would depend on the support of merchants and landowners. So economics was a big part of the government system in the Netherlands. Dutch art was really powerful. You have Rembrandt van Rijn, Rembrandt, one of the most famous artists in the history of the world. He specialized in doing group portraits with light and dark contrast. And then you also have Jan Vermeer, who did a lot of indoor setting portraits with women doing normal activities. He had The Girl with the Pearl Earring is one that is a movie's made on, it's with Scarlett Johansson, about Jan Vermeer. And then also you had paintings called The Milkmaid, just women kind of doing everyday normal things. One of the things to remember here is that the work of these two artists actually in their work revealed the importance, though, of the economy, the daily workers such as merchants, civic leaders, people in the middle class during the 1600s. So we can learn a great deal about history from that art. Also, we'll take a look at the Dutch trading empire. The Dutch bought a surplus of grain from Poland, smart move by them, at a very low price. They then stored that excess grain in warehouses. During the span of some dismal harvests in Southern Europe, the Dutch began to sell that excess grain for a very high price. So remember, supply and demand. If in Southern Europe there's drought, there's famine, there's a lack of grain, they are in high demand for grain. Okay, so the supply is low, but the demand is high, okay, the Dutch are going to make bank off of this because they're going to be able to set a very high price because they know people who don't have it really need it. And so what's going to end up happening is they're going to sell that, and then their economy is really going to increase. And they were able to take some of this money and invest in a fleet of ships that became the largest fleet in the world by 1636 at 4,800 ships. And this naval fleet helped protect the ships of the Dutch East India Company, which furthered their expanse in trade and exploration. Roman numeral 5 now is going to switch gears and talk about absolutism. So absolutism is absolute rule. It means what the king says goes. And absolute monarchs are kings or queens who held all of the power within their state's boundaries or country's boundaries. Their power to rule was supported by a concept back then that was propagated also by the church, which was called divine right. Divine right is the concept that absolute monarchs believed that God created the monarchy and that the monarch was acting as God's representative on earth. This is why absolute rule was able to come to fruition. It's because these kings would have power and sway. They were sometimes appointing bishops, which is called lay investiture. And so what was going on in churches is that in the homilies and in the talks, priests might be devoting some of their time to getting people to understand divine right and propagating that thought process to which would give people who were uneducated the understanding that they needed to kind of not exactly worship the king, but believe that the king was God's representative on earth. This was a very common practice back in these times, 1500s, 1600s, 1700s. Also, we have European monarchs and power. One of the things you have to understand is because there's a decline in feudalism, you now have people moving off of the manors, okay, the feudal manors, and they're moving into cities. This leads to the growth of national kingdoms, which then people develop a nationalistic thought like, oh, I'm Spanish, I'm French, I'm English. And this helps to centralize authority with the power of the king, who they saw as the sole leader of their kingdom or country. Merchants that also backed monarchs because they believed that they could offer a peaceful and supportive business climate, because if you had the backing of the merchants, the monarch could then utilize this as a form to increase the overall economy of the country. So they were working together economically to drive this power as well. There is a couple of other things that I want to mention. Monarchs in this light would use money from the American colonies to fund their endeavors. And then eventually you got to understand that the reason that kings became powerful is due to crisis. 17th century in Europe, 1600s, was full of religious and territorial wars. Rulers would attempt to regulate everything to free themselves from the limits imposed on them by the former nobles and representative governments like Parliament. They wanted to be absolutely in charge. They wanted to get rid of parliaments, of constitutional monarchy. They did not want to give people individual rights. And they were saying that they were taking away those rights in exchange for defense. So what kings would propagate the idea is that they were taking away individual rights, but they were offering the people overall protection from the army that they were using their money to pay and create. This is a little bit different than in feudalism, where you relied on local lords and knights to defend the land. Okay, now, big picture question at the end here that I would ask my students is, why might an absolute monarch view a republic such as the Netherlands as a political threat? Well, the idea where people get to make decisions, the idea where there's limits on what a king can and cannot do, is something that absolute monarchs would not want out there for fear of rebellion, revolt, or independence movements. Thank you.